Welcome back. So what's the power situation like at your end, wherever you're watching from? Has power begun to be restored, especially after reports by the mainstream media yesterday that at about 2 p.m. The power situation came to zero, but hours later restoration efforts began with some of the power stations beginning to report over 120 megawatts, in some situations over 140 megawatts. And so what exactly is the culture of maintenance like for power stations in 2025 as against what was reported in 2024? Let's get an understanding of the progress and challenges of the Ministry of Power as, you know, the efforts to get Nigeria to enjoy 24 hours of power supply continues in 2025. And so it's an important conversation to have, also against the backdrop of, you know, the efforts by the Regulatory Commission to hand over regulation of the power market to states of the Federation, which also has been ongoing. And how effectively have the states also been showing up, you know, when you also consider the Electricity Reform Act passed by the former administration that now gives states the, you know, the power and the wherewithal to also legislate for power. How are they showing up? What are the interventions that are being provided, you know, against the backdrop of, you know, Nigeria having an abundance of, you know, natural resources to be able to, you know, provide power supply for itself? So it's a critical conversation to have.
And for more context, data from the distribution companies we call DISCOs sometimes revealed that only 2 operators received electricity at the time of the collapse yesterday. Ibadan Electricity Distribution Company recorded a load of 30 megawatts, and Abuja Electricity Distribution Company received 20 megawatts. All other companies were allocated 0, meaning Eko, Enugu, Ikeja, Jos, Kaduna, Kano, Port Harcourt. I must say that I also experienced it, but later, I think midnight, power was restored. But come on. This is December 30th. Is this how we want to get into the new year, Bukola?
Certainly not. Let's find out more from our guest who joins us now virtually. Mr. Ayodele Oni is an energy lawyer. Good morning, sir. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me.
So let's begin with maybe a comparison, which is important, between 2024 and 2025. There was a record, about a dozen, you know, power grid collapses recorded in 2024 as against just a number that we have seen in 2025. What are the, you know, reforms that have been put in place that have reduced the power, you know, grid collapses that we have recorded in 2025, and how can those reforms be maintained?
Thank you very much. Very good question. A number of things have been done. One of them, and you may have heard and may have confused a lot of people initially, there's a free governor regime which the NERC introduced, such that power generating units can sort of control frequency where there are challenges on the grid. That's one. Secondly, the emergency management system has improved. You know, we always spoke about the supervisory control and data acquisition, which can remotely monitor the system. I think government has looked at that, and if you go to Oshogbo, that's the National Control Center, you'd find out that you've got SCADA in place, and an emergency management system too has improved. There's also been a number of transmission projects with government working with Siemens, the distribution companies too have done some infrastructural development and improved equipment, because, you know, we always spoke about poor emergency management. The issues were technical and commercial, right? Aging infrastructure and all of that. So I think this is probably the 4th this year compared to about a dozen last year and previously. You know, between, I think, 2020 and 2022, we had over 200, maybe 246. We had quite a number, right? So it's progressively improved, but there's still quite a bit of work to be done. So you have SCADA, you have better infrastructure, energy management, even the commercials too, right? And you're aware that the government is looking to pay gas producers or get GenCos are able to pay gas producers under the auspices of the government, a financing arrangement the government has put in place. Because if you do not have gas supply, of course, or inconsistent gas supply, you'd also suffer the same fate, because it would then mean that there'd be a mismatch between demand and supply on the grid, because power plants, over 80% of our generation is gas-fired. So I think these have been the challenges, and government have begun to work on resolving each one, and they've been historical challenges. So that's why we see the improvement.
Dr. Oni, very interesting. While that was playing out yesterday, a lot of people saw the news that billionaire businessman Femi Otedola exited Geregu Power in a landmark $750 million deal, essentially selling his 77% controlling interests. And you know Geregu contributes about a tithe to national grid supply. So people are wondering, is this related? Is there something off with the, the power sector? But you say that this year is even better than the previous year. So how do we ensure that next year is even much better? I know you've mentioned some of them, but we still have a situation where people are still being billed with estimated billing. There are people who believe they are paying more than they consume, perhaps as a result of the connection. Some people didn't even know that there are ways that your meter can be connected and you end up paying more than you are meant to pay, and say, well, reports to public complaints and all of that. So these challenges are still there, very much with us. So 2026, what should be the New Year resolutions for the power industry? I'm talking from distribution companies to generations and transmission.
Okay. First is to ensure metering. There's a metering initiative by the presidency, and I think that more efforts should be put into that. Where we suffer in Nigeria usually is implementation. We have brilliant people, we have brilliant ideas, and policies is just ensuring that implementation is properly done. And I think from a distribution angle, continuing to improve the infrastructure and the equipment, and also ensuring metering. Recall that the NERC, the regulator, there have been regulations around enforcing metering and ensuring that there's no estimated billing. At times, implementation then becomes, or enforcement becomes, a problem. And what may even compound that problem, depending on how you see it, could make it better or compound it, is the fact that a number of states have taken over electricity regulation in their own states. So working with NERC, they should ensure that people are metered, so that if you don't get metered, then you don't pay. I think that's one. Two, I think I always say generation isn't a problem in Nigeria. If we solve the transmission and distribution conundrum, then you'd have investors falling over each one another to invest in the generation bit. As long as you can also ensure that there's gas supply, right? I think people, part of what I've heard around the collapse was the helps, vandalism or some damage to the Escravos Lagos pipeline, so that I call it in full. It supplies gas. It's one of the major pipelines. There are, maybe I can say three now: the eastern and the western, and you now have the northern coming on stream with also the AKK, the Ajaokuta Kaduna Kano. You have the Oben, you have the Escravos to Lagos pipeline. So if one of those, which are now being integrated, has a challenge, it affects gas supply. And if it affects gas supply to power generation companies, then they can't supply. I don't think from a generation standpoint there are issues, there are serious issues. It's transmission and distribution, because no one wants to invest in generation when, if they sell power, they don't get paid, or they can't even wheel their power from the generation plant elsewhere because transmission is poor. So government needs to continue to do a lot around transmission, work with states that have taken over the generation, the power sector within their boundaries, so that they can make progress. And I also think the gas issue needs to be resolved, and infrastructure for gas, which is already improving. For a long time we had an unintegrated arrangement where ELPS was different from the eastern, but an integration is going on also with the northern one, and that's the AKK, Ajaokuta Kaduna Kano pipeline. So I think those are the things that need to be done. Then the big elephant in the room, the issue around subsidy. You know, a decision needs to be taken. It gets very controversial, particularly when states take over, whether they are then still entitled to subsidy or to consider subsidy in their tariff arrangement, right? The federal government needs to have a position. I think that it'd be a serious debate and a challenge if you say certain states won't once they take over and some states will, you know. So I think those are the issues. And infrastructure, continue to have the right guys in the right places, continue to improve infrastructure. The deal with Siemens should continue so that we have more generation. And there are a number of grid projects too. In rural areas, you have the Rural Electrification Agency doing quite a bit with solar and off-grid and distributed generation. You know, so it's a potpourri of various things all coming together, and I must say that every government has played a role in moving us forward. You know, from the times of President Obasanjo to Jonathan, who ensured that there was privatization and taking us from the old behemoth of NEPA, PHCN to having the private sector. So let's just continue to move things forward as they seem, because a number of people would say power has improved where they live, particularly those in Band A. So we just need to continue to move forward. Like where I do stay, the estate does have its own independent power generation, and I wasn't even aware of initially aware of the grid collapse. So I think everyone is doing something or the other to improve and to move us forward in the sector. We just need to do much more.
Speaking of one component in that potpourri that you talk about, besides the reforms that you earlier highlighted, I wonder what your observations are as far as security around the power infrastructure itself is concerned, the power stations, because I recall there was a huge concern around security around the power stations, and there were reports of some power stations being in the hands of terrorists at the time, and there were questions of accountability from the transmission company of Nigeria. So what are your observations in that regard, and how can it be made sustainable if we have recorded progress from 2024?
Okay, I think it's similar to what you have with oil and gas. I think the structure is similar, such that host communities have skin in the game. If host communities have skin in the game, it always makes things better. You see that vandalism happening around oil and gas, oil pipelines in particular, because of the host communities trust arrangement, is reduced substantially. I mean, I'm sure you also believe that for heirs holdings to be able to raise substantial sums from Afrexim, there must be good cause, right? And same, we have similar provisions in the Electricity Act, particularly with the amendment signed by the president. I think was it last year or 2 years ago? You know, I think it was last year, early last year. So host communities. And maybe we need even more modifications so that they have more skin in the game. I think if you have more skin in the game, then they're going to ensure that, and more skin being that some of the income comes to them, not necessarily directly, but in form of infrastructure, in form of maybe even some form of dividends, right? I think that's one system or one strategy that can be utilized to ensure that if people have skin in the game, they're going to do everything within their powers to protect. I'm not sure it's just about government. I think it's a collaborative approach that is required. And, you know, modern technology, like using drones and the sort, there's been that contract some years ago. It's just whether it was enforced, whether the guys who got the contract have done what they ought to do. I think that those are important questions that need to be asked, and let host communities have more skin in the game. I think I'd leave it at that.
Indeed, a fine place to anchor, and hope that the reforms that you have talked about will be sustained, and hopefully will not be reporting power grid collapses at the beginning of 2026. Mr. Ayodele Oni is an energy lawyer who has joined us on this one. Thank you for coming through on the program.
Thank you very much.
We'll take a moment now. When we return, we have something interesting to tell and to show you. We'll keep it on the wraps. You'll find out after this time out. Stay with us.